October 14th, 1943, 25,000 feet above Germany. Staff Sergeant Michael Romano understands he's probably going to die today, and there's absolutely nothing he can do about it. He's crouched in what the crews call the tail gunner position, a cramped space at the back of the B-17 Flying Fortress, barely large enough for a man to kneel. Through the small plexiglass window behind him, Romano watches a German Fokker-Wulf 190 positioning for attack. The fighter approaches from 6 o'clock low, the bomber's most vulnerable angle, and Romano knows exactly what's about to happen because he's seen it happen 23 times in the past 6 weeks. His hands grip twin 50 caliber machine guns as he peers through the aiming system, which consists of 2 metal posts that he must manually align with a target moving at combined closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. There's no computer calculating deflection angles, no mechanism compensating for the aircraft's motion, no assistance whatsoever as both planes hurtle through freezing air 40 degrees below zero. He must estimate where the fighter will be in the next second, account for bullet drop across the distance, and execute these calculations while wearing gloves so thick he can barely feel the triggers. Romano fires a burst, watches his tracers arc into empty sky behind the diving fighter. The Germans' cannons flash in response, and Romano feels his bomber shudder as 20mm shells punch through aluminum fuselage. This scene is repeating itself 291 times today, across what will become known as the Second Schweinfurt raid. The 8th Air Force has dispatched nearly 300 B-17s deep into Germany without facesuit, fighter escort, and by nightfall 60 of those bombers will be shot down, more than 20% of the attacking force destroyed in a single afternoon. Another 138 will return so badly damaged they'll never fly again. 600 American airmen will be dead before sunset. The numbers tell a brutal story. At current loss rates, no bomber crew will statistically survive the required 25 missions. Post-mission analysis reveals that tail gunners, supposedly the last line of defense against rear attacks, are achieving hit rates below 8%. Luftwaffe pilots have learned they can simply attack from behind, endure a few seconds of wildly inaccurate return fire, and methodically destroy the American bomber stream one fortress at a time. But what nobody knows yet is that tonight, a 22-year-old factory worker from Pittsburgh is going to sketch something in his logbook that will change everything. Something that violates regulations, something that will save thousands of lives. Though first, he's going to lose someone who matters. Michael Romano enlisted in the Army Air Forces at 19, hoping to escape the steel mills of Pittsburgh where he'd worked since dropping out of high school at 16. The military assigned him to aerial gunnery school, not because of any demonstrated talent, but because at 5 feet 7 inches and 145 pounds, he could fit into spaces that eliminated larger recruits. His training lasted 6 weeks. They taught him how to clear jammed weapons, estimate range to moving targets, and maintain the Browning M2 machine guns that would become his responsibility. What they couldn't teach him was how to hit anything with equipment designed 40 years earlier. Romano flew his first combat mission on August 19, 1943, targeting an airfield in the Netherlands. He fired 480 rounds at 3 attacking German fighters, and afterwards he was certain he'd scored hits. The gun camera footage told a different story. Every single tracer had passed harmlessly behind the targets. The fighters went on to destroy 2 bombers in his formation, and Romano watched both aircraft fall from the sky with parachutes blossoming behind them like flowers. After his 3rd mission, he stayed on the aircraft hardstand long after everyone else had left, staring at his guns. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from the physical exhaustion of wrestling 84-pound weapons through sustained fire while kneeling at high altitude. That night he started sketching in his logbook, trying to understand why the aiming system felt so inadequate. The problem wasn't the guns themselves. The 50 caliber Brownings were reliable and powerful. The problem wasn't even his training. The problem was that tailgun jammers were expected to hit maneuvering fighters using aiming technology that hadn't evolved since the First World War. And Romano was beginning to understand that no amount of practice would overcome equipment that simply didn't work. Then came October 4th, 1943, his 5th mission, Frankfurt. That's when everything changed, though not in any way Romano wanted. His bomber returned that afternoon with 78 flak holes and battle damage out from 2 separate fighter attacks. Romano had fired 620 rounds during the mission and hadn't hit anything. But that wasn't the worst part of the day. His best friend died that morning. A kid from Boston named Parker who'd gone through training with Romano and shipped overseas on the same transport. They'd flown their first missions together, complained about the food together, written letters home sitting next to each other in the barracks. Parker's bomber was attacked from directly behind by a German Bf-109, and Romano watched through his own window as Parker returned fire. He could see the tracers arcing uselessly behind the diving fighter, could see the German closing the distance, could do nothing except listen on the radio as Parker called for help. Parker's voice climbed toward panic as he reported his guns weren't hitting the target. Then Romano heard the sound of German cannons, heard Parker scream, then silence. The bomber went into a nobody got out. Romano didn't sleep that night, couldn't eat. Around midnight, he walked alone to the aircraft revetment, carrying a maintenance flashlight, climbed into his tail section, and sat there in the darkness. The metal still carried the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid from that afternoon's mission. He stared at the ring and bead sight for a long time, trying to understand why 17 pilots from his group had died in the past month using this same equipment. The sight itself wasn't complicated, just a metal ring with a post at its centre, identical in principle to the sights on a hunting rifle. But a hunting rifle shoots at stationary targets on the ground. A tail gunner shoots at fighters manoeuvring three-dimensionally at 400 miles per hour. The insight came from an unexpected place. Romano noticed his own reflection in the curved plexiglass window, distorted and ghostly in the beam of his flashlight. In that warped mirror image, he could see angles behind his aircraft that the gunsight couldn't cover. He could see what was coming from directions that iron sights never reached. He sat up straighter, looking at the reflection more carefully. What if that wasn't a problem? What if it was a solution? Romano pulled out his logbook and started sketching. Small mirrors positioned at specific angles could give him peripheral vision beyond the gunsight's limited field of view. More importantly, if he angled them correctly, they could show him the paths his own tracers were taking in real time, letting him adjust his fire by watching the reflection instead of guessing through inadequate iron sights. Then the crucial idea arrived. What if he combined those mirrors with a reflector sight like the ones fighter pilots used? A piece of glass with an illuminated aiming reticle that would let him track targets while simultaneously monitoring his tracer patterns in the peripheral mirrors. It wouldn't be a sophisticated computing sight like fighters carried. Those required gyroscopes and power supplies. This would be simpler. A combination of reflective surfaces and salvaged components. Romano spent 3 hours that night working out the angles, measuring sight lines with a carpenter's protractor he'd borrowed from the base machine shop. By dawn, he had detailed drawings for a system that required no powered components and no factory modifications. He also had a problem. What he was proposing violated Army Air Forces regulations explicitly. Technical Order 01-20-EG-2 prohibited unauthorized modifications to defensive armament, and the penalties for violation included court-martial and possible prison time. Romano made his decision while watching the sun rise over the English countryside. Parker was dead because the equipment didn't work. More pilots would die tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Unless someone did something the regulations said was impossible. He needed help. Someone who could fabricate components without asking too many questions. Someone willing to risk their career for a chance to save lives. The next morning, Romano found that person in the base sheet metal shop. Technical Sergeant Frank Kellerman was 38 years old enough to be Romano's father, and had spent the Depression years with the Civilian Conservation Corps building bridges across Michigan with whatever materials he could scavenge. When Romano approached him on October 7th, carrying hand-drawn sketches and requesting fabrication work that nobody had approved, Kellerman studied the drawings for several minutes without speaking. Finally, he looked up. "You understand what you're asking me to do?" It wasn't a question. "Yes, Sergeant. This violates multiple technical orders. Could cost us both our careers." "I know." Kellerman tapped the drawings with one grease-stained finger. "When do you fly next?" "Tomorrow morning, Münster." Kellerman nodded once, folded the drawings, and stood. Then I suggest we stop discussing regulations and start building this thing before you get killed using equipment that doesn't work." They began after midnight in a corner of the maintenance hangar, using materials Kellerman had acquired through channels that existed outside official supply chains. The components came from salvaged aircraft parts, curved mirrors extracted from damaged navigation equipment, plexiglass sheets from shattered canopies, aluminum stock from airframes that had been written off as beyond repair. The reflector sight itself, the critical component, came from a wrecked P-47 Thunderbolt fighter that had crashed during a training flight. Kellerman removed the undamaged gunsight assembly and spent 2 hours redesigning the mounting brackets to fit the cramped tail gunner position. The mirror system proved more challenging. Romano wanted 3 small convex mirrors positioned at precise angles to provide peripheral vision without obstructing his forward view. Kellerman fabricated adjustable brackets from sheet aluminum and ball socket joints, salvaged from damaged control linkages, then spent the early morning hours fitting components, testing sightlines, making minute adjustments. At 4:30 in the morning, Kellerman installed the complete assembly in Romano's aircraft. A B-17G that carried the name Knockout Dropper painted on its nose. The installation would have horrified Boeing's engineers. Brackets attached with standard aircraft bolts, mirrors secured with safety wire, the reflector sight mounted via a bracket that Kellerman had welded himself using techniques that existed nowhere in official maintenance manuals. Nothing about the modification appeared in any logbook. At dawn briefing, Romano mentioned nothing to his pilot or crew. The group commander remained unaware. The squadron armament officer had no idea what was about to fly into German airspace. They launched for the Münster at 7:30. 3 hours later, over Germany, a German Bf-109 began its attack run from 6 o'clock low, and Romano looked through his new reflector sight for the first time in combat. The illuminated reticle floated in his field of vision, overlaying the approaching fighter. In his peripheral vision, the mirrors showed him exactly where his gun barrels were pointing. For the first time in his combat career, Romano had instant feedback about where his weapons were actually aimed. He fired a short burst. The tracers visible in his peripheral mirrors showed him shooting behind the target. He adjusted his aim, leading the fighter by the width of the reticle, and fired again. This time the tracers converged with the target. The Bf-19's engine exploded in a shower of debris. Romano's hands were shaking as he watched the German fighter tumble out of control, trailing black smoke toward the forest below. His first confirmed kill after 6 missions of failure. He whispered into his oxygen mask, "It actually works." When he landed at Bassingbourn 3 hours later, the ground crew swarmed his aircraft in celebration. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey. His pilot, Lieutenant James Holbrook, clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to hurt. The celebration lasted approximately 20 minutes. That's when Crew Chief Master Sergeant Donald Pierce conducted his routine post-flight inspection, opened the tail section and discovered equipment that hadn't been there the previous day. Pierce immediately reported to Captain Richard Voss, the squadron armament officer, who arrived at the hard stand carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression that promised serious consequences. Voss's voice could have etched steel when he spoke. "Sergeant Romano, perhaps you'd care to explain the unauthorized equipment I'm observing in your gun position?" Romano came to attention. "Sir, I installed an improved aiming system." "You installed?" Voss's volume increased with each word. "Sergeant, are you aware that you violated Technical Order 01-20-EG-2, which explicitly prohibits unauthorized modifications to defensive armament? This isn't your personal automobile. This is combat equipment worth $500,000. Unapproved changes can compromise structural integrity, create fire hazards, and potentially interfere with other aircraft systems." "Sir, the system works. I achieved my first." "Your results are completely irrelevant to this discussion," Voss interrupted, gesturing toward the tail section. "That equipment lacks Army Air Force's approval. Boeing hasn't certified it. No testing protocols have been conducted. You will remove it immediately, or I will have you court-martialed for willful destruction of government property." Lieutenant Holbrook tried to intervene. "Captain, My tail gunner got his first kill today using that sight. Perhaps we should—" "Your opinion has been noted, Lieutenant," Voss cut him off. "The modification will be removed. That decision is final." But by evening mess, word had spread through the entire 91st Bomb Group. Every gunner on base knew about Romano's forbidden mirror sight and his confirmed kill. Veteran gunners surrounded his table in the mess hall, asking rapid-fire questions about installation difficulty, field of view, whether the mirrors could withstand the slipstream at combat speeds. The engineering officers and senior maintenance staff reacted very differently, with something approaching alarm. Captain Theodore Morrison, the group's assistant armament officer, convened an emergency meeting the following morning. 14 officers attended, and the atmosphere in the briefing room was hostile from the moment Morrison called the meeting to order. "Gentlemen, Morrison began. We have a discipline problem that could set a dangerous precedent. A sergeant has performed unauthorized modifications using salvaged components of questionable provenance. If we allow every enlisted man to redesign his weapon system based on personal preference—" Major William Calhoun, the operations officer, stood abruptly. "With all due respect, sir, that's complete nonsense. Romano shot down an enemy fighter using this system," Calhoun continued. "Our tail gunners currently achieve hit rates around 8%. If his modification improves that even marginally—" "Marginally?" Morrison's face reddened. "Major, we have zero data, zero formal testing. One successful engagement doesn't validate anything." "Then conduct testing," Calhoun fired back. "Put Romano up tomorrow with the modification installed and gun cameras recording. If it doesn't work, remove it. If it does work, maybe we should be installing these systems across the group instead of threatening to court-martial the man who invented it." The argument intensified rapidly. Engineers cited safety concerns and regulatory violations. Combat officers cited weekly casualty statistics that were making daylight bombing unsustainable. Within minutes, the meeting had devolved into officers shouting over each other. At 8 o'clock that evening, the dispute reached Colonel Stanley Ray, commanding officer of the 91st Bomb Group. Ray had flown bombers in the First World War and was now 53 years old, a career officer with reputation for both strict discipline and battlefield pragmatism. He listened to passionate arguments from both sides for 90 minutes without interrupting once. When the room finally fell silent, Ray spoke quietly. "How many bombers did this group lose last week?" Nobody answered immediately. "Captain Morrison, I believe I asked you a question." 17 aircraft, sir." 17 B-17s from this group alone," Ray repeated. "And how many German fighters did our tail gunners shoot down during those same missions? Confirmed kills only." 3 confirmed, sir." Ray let that sink in for a moment. 17 bombers carrying 170 American boys lost in exchange for 3 confirmed enemy fighters. He looked directly at Morrison. "Captain, your concerns about unauthorized modifications are both noted and valid. Your concerns about proper procedures and safety protocols are entirely appropriate. But I'm considerably more concerned about losing 17 aircraft every week because our defensive armament fundamentally doesn't work the way we need it to work." He turned to face Romano, who had been standing at attention throughout the entire meeting. "Sergeant, your modification will remain on your aircraft. You'll fly the next 3 missions with gun cameras recording every engagement. If your hit rate improves measurably and consistently, I'll authorize installation across the entire group. If it doesn't, we'll remove the equipment and you'll face appropriate disciplinary action for the unauthorized modification. Is that clear?" Romano saluted. "Yes, sir." "Gentlemen," Ray stood, "this meeting is concluded. Captain Morrison, please prepare engineering documentation for a potential group-wide installation. And somebody get me a complete set of Sergeant Kellerman's fabrication drawings." Over the next 3 missions, Romano would prove that his system worked. Then the question would become how quickly it could spread, because the 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than factories could replace them, and time was running out. October 12, 1943. Bremen, Romano's 4th combat mission, carrying the modified sight system with gun cameras recording every moment. At 11:23 over the German coast, a Fokker-Wulf 190 dove from 7 o'clock high. Romano tracked through his reflector sight, made real-time adjustments based on his mirror feedback, and fired a controlled burst. The FW190's wing root erupted in flames. First kill of the mission. 24 minutes later, a BF-109 approached from directly astern in the classic tail attack profile. Romano centered his reticle, verified his alignment in the peripheral mirrors, and fired. The 109's canopy shattered. The fighter rolled inverted and dove away, trailing debris. Second kill. Romano returned to Bassingbourn with 2 confirmed kills and 1 probable. His ammunition expenditure for the mission was 380 rounds total, 190 rounds per kill. The typical tail gunner averaged 2,800 rounds per confirmed kill. Even Captain Morrison couldn't dispute the gun camera evidence. The mirror-reflector combination provided real-time fire correction that was simply impossible with the traditional ring and bead sights. Within 48 hours, Colonel Ray had authorized group-wide implementation. What followed was an improvised manufacturing operation that would have horrified every procurement bureaucrat in Washington. Kellerman organized his maintenance team into a production line, scavenging reflector sights from damaged P-47 fighters, mirrors from wrecked navigation systems, and aluminum stock from supply warehouses. They were fabricating 4 complete mirror sight systems per day. By October 20th, 18 B-17s in the 91st Bomb Group were flying with Romano's modification. The results were immediate and dramatic. During the Duran mission that day, tail gunners equipped with mirror reflector sights achieved 11 confirmed kills against 47 separate fighter attacks, a hit rate of 23.4%, nearly triple the previous average. The pattern continued. Wilhelmshaven on November the 3rd, 16 confirmed kills. Gelsenkirchen on November 5th, 13 confirmed kills. The mathematical transformation of bomber survivability was undeniable. Luftwaffe pilots who had grown accustomed to attacking B-17s from the rear with relative impunity suddenly found themselves facing accurate, sustained defensive fire. German after-action reports began noting increased effectiveness of American tail armament and recommending revised approach tactics. Major Hans-Joachim Jabs, a Luftwaffe night fighter ace temporarily assigned to day operations, wrote in his combat diary, "The flying fortresses have become significantly more dangerous. Their tail gunners now demonstrate accuracy we previously observed only in powered turrets. Attacks from this rear quadrant now carry unacceptable risk." By mid-November, word had reached 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe. On November 18th, a staff car arrived at Bassingbourn unannounced, and out stepped Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commander of the 4th Bombardment Wing. Castle spent 30 minutes interviewing Romano personally, examining the mirror assembly and reviewing gun camera footage. Before departing, he made a decision that would spread Romano's innovation across hundreds of aircraft. General Castle authorized immediate implementation across the entire 4th Bombardment Wings. Every B-17 would receive the modification within 30 days. By December 1943, Romano's mirror reflector sight system, now officially designated Field Expedient Tailgun Aiming System, Type 1, had been installed in over 200 bombers across multiple groups. Boeing's Cheyenne Modification Center, already developing an improved tail turret, incorporated Romano's reflector sight principles directly into their design. The production Cheyenne turret that began appearing on B-17Gs in January 1944 featured an N8 reflector sight, positioned almost exactly where Romano had placed his salvage P-47 sight. The impact on Luftwaffe tactics was measurable. German fighter units were forced to abandon their preferred 6 o'clock attack profile, shifting toward more dangerous head-on approaches to avoid the newly effective tail defences. Luftwaffe losses began climbing throughout the winter of 1944. Romano continued flying combat missions through February 1944. His personal tally reached 7 confirmed kills and 4 probables, exceptional for any tail gunner. But more importantly, his innovation was spreading through the 8th Air Force and eventually to the 15th Air Force operating from Italy, ultimately influencing defensive armament modifications on B-24 Liberators as well. On February 22, 1944, Romano's war ended during big week operations over Leipzig. His bomber took heavy flak damage at 13,000 feet. Hydraulic lines severed. fuel tanks punctured, 2 engines burning. Romano's tail section flooded with hydraulic fluid and fuel spray, but he continued engaging German fighters through the mist, keeping them at a distance while his pilot fought to reach Allied territory. They crash-landed in a Belgian field. The fuselage broke apart on impact. Romano's tail section separated completely, and he was thrown clear with broken ribs and a dislocated shoulder. The entire crew survived, but German patrols captured them 3 days later, despite Belgian resistance efforts to hide them. Romano spent the final 15 months of the war in Stalag Luft 4, a prisoner of war camp in Poland. He returned to the United States in May 1945, weighing 127 pounds, 18 pounds lighter than his enlistment weight. The Army Air Forces awarded him the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation noted his innovative contribution to defensive armament effectiveness, while carefully avoiding any mention that his innovation had initially been completely illegal. Romano never sought publicity afterward. He declined interview requests, turned down Boeing's invitation to discuss the Cheyenne turret development, and returned to Pittsburgh, where he married his high school sweetheart and worked as a machinist for the next 37 years. His children grew up knowing only that their father had flown in bombers during the war and had done something with gunsights, but the full story of what Romano's illegal modification actually accomplished wouldn't become clear until decades later, when military historians began analysing the numbers. In 1983, 40 years after Romano's first combat mission, the 91st Bomb Group Association held a reunion at Bassingbourn Airfield, which had been preserved as a historical site. Several former tail gunners who had flown with Romano's mirror reflector sights made the trip back to England. One of them, a man named Gerald Hammond, brought something he'd kept for 4 decades, a salvaged mirror bracket from his own aircraft. Hammond had been 20 years old in 1943, flying his first combat missions while Romano was developing his modification. He'd received the mirror sight system in November of that year and had flown 31 missions with it before the war ended. At the reunion dinner, Hammond stood and asked Romano to join him at the front of the room. Romano, now 60 years old and grey-haired, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, reluctantly stood. Hammond held up the bracket, its aluminum surface dulled with age. "I've carried this with me for 40 years, he said quietly. Moved it from apartment to apartment, house to house. My wife asked me multiple times why I kept a piece of junk metal in our garage." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "Because of the mirror, and because of what you did in violation of every regulation in the book, I came home. My children exist because you couldn't accept that lousy gun sights were just something we had to live with." Romano looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "You would have done the same thing," he said. "We all just wanted to survive long enough to get home." Hammond shook his head. "That's where you're wrong, Mike. Thousands of tailgunners faced the same inadequate equipment, the same impossible firing solutions, the same terrible casualty rates. But only one of them refused to accept the status quo. Only one had the audacity to break the regulations, the skill to improvise a solution, and the courage to risk court-martial for a chance to save lives." The room was silent. "The difference between you and everyone else," Hammond continued, "wasn't skill or intelligence or training. It was that you chose to act when everyone else, myself included, just complained and endured." Romano didn't know how to respond to that. He never had. When he died in 2003 at age 79, his obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette would mention his military service in a single line: World War II veteran, 8th Air Force. The obituary wouldn't mention that his illegal modification had become standard equipment, wouldn't mention the thousands of lives saved, wouldn't mention that while generals and engineers debated regulations and testing protocols, 22-year-old factory worker from Pittsburgh had solved a problem they couldn't. But there's a broader lesson in Romano's story that extends beyond the specific technical innovation he created, a lesson about how real change happens under pressure. Post-war analysis by the US Strategic Bombing Survey determined that B-17 groups equipped with improved tailgun sights suffered between 32 and 37% fewer losses from tail attacks compared to aircraft with standard equipment. Across thousands of bomber missions, that percentage translated to approximately 840 aircraft that survived combat, they statistically shouldn't have survived. 840 aircraft, each carrying 10 crewmen. That's 8,400 American airmen who came home because a sergeant couldn't accept inadequate tools and possessed the courage to break regulations to save lives. Romano's story matters not because of the specific technical solution he created, though that was certainly significant. It matters because it reveals a pattern about how innovation actually happens under extreme pressure, not through official procurement channels that require months of review, not through committees that debate safety protocols while people die, but through individuals who see problems, understand they possess the skills to solve them, and choose to act despite the potential consequences. The Army of Hawaii, our forces initially wanted to court-martial Romano. The regulations were explicit. Captain Morrison's concerns about unauthorized modifications were entirely legitimate from a procedural standpoint. But Colonel Ray understood something that regulations alone cannot capture, that sometimes the most responsible decision is to test a solution rather than enforce a rule, especially when lives hang in the balance. Romano's innovation eventually became official. Boeing incorporated his principles into production aircraft. The system received formal designation and engineering approval, but that happened only after one sergeant chose to build it without permission, and one colonel chose to test it rather than punish the man who had broken the rules. If you found this story compelling, we'd appreciate your support. Hit the like button to help us share more untold stories about the enlisted personnel who changed the course of the war through innovations that regulations initially prohibited. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future episodes about the mechanics, gunners, and sergeants whose courage kept our forces fighting and surviving. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you're a veteran, a family member of someone who served, or simply someone who believes these stories deserve to be remembered. Our community spans the globe, and every person who shares these histories helps ensure they don't disappear into silence. Michael Romano never wanted recognition for what he did. He turned down interviews and declined invitations to discuss his modification. He spent 37 years working as a machinist without ever mentioning his wartime innovation to most people he knew. But Romano deserves to be remembered, not just for the specific mirror sight system he created, but for what he represents, the thousands of enlisted men throughout military history who identified problems that officers and engineers missed, who improvised solutions with whatever materials they could scavenge, and who chose to act when following regulations would have meant watching their friends die. Thank you for watching, and for helping ensure these stories survive.